So as Paul said, we're going to talk about habitat preferences of the Plateau Spot-tailed Earless Lizard today, also known as Holbrookia lacerata, which is what I'll probably mostly refer to it as throughout the presentation. Uh, oops. There we go. Okay. But before we get into the details, I would like to thank everyone who assisted me with the fieldwork, as well as the members of my committee. I appreciate everybody's help in the research, and I additionally want to thank our funders, TPWD, for making this project happen. So getting started, Holbrookia lacerata. This is the Plateau Spot-tailed Earless Lizard, and as the name suggests, it is native to the Edwards Plateau, north of the Balcones Escarpment. This is the only Texas endemic lizard. Endemic just means it is native to a certain region, and that basically means that it is the only lizard species whose entire range lies within Texas. In 2011, the species went under review for federal review for potential listing due to perceived population declines and a lack of pre-existing knowledge on the species. However, in February of 2024, it was decided that the species was not going to be listed at the federal level. However, it remains a Texas SGCN listed species, listed as an imperiled species. So this species was recently split from Holbrookia subcaudalus. They were both recently considered Holbrookia lacerata, especially back when they were listed in 2011, but they were split in the last few years, and they are divided geographically by the Balcones Escarpment, which is highlighted on the right here. My species is north of it on the Edwards Plateau, and then the closely related but distinct Holbrookia subcaudalus is south of the Balcones Escarpment and extends into Mexico. So speaking of the Edwards Plateau, where this species is native, historically this was an open grassland region with patches of trees. Bison and pronghorn antelope were native grazing species, and this area was subject to periodic fires. However, it has experienced a lot of transformation since European settlers moved into the region around the 1880s. That natural fire cycle was suppressed by the European settlers, and grazing became very cattle-based. The native yet problematic ash and redberry junipers, which are pictured here to the left, have since begun to spread a lot across the grasslands. This woody plant encroachment has crowded out these once open grassland areas. So my field site, the Sonora Station, was established in 1915 on the right. You can see it resides south of Sonora and north of Rock Springs, Texas, and actually sits kind of right on the county line between Sutton and Edwards counties. Throughout those last 100+ years, their main focus for the study and the experiment station have been livestock sciences and rangeland management. More recently, since about the year 2000, one of their focuses has been the management of juniper encroachment in particular. One of their major experimental results to come out of this focus was the juniper eating goat, which is pictured here up to the top and to the bottom left. This goat was bred by the station to specialize in being able to eat junipers. One of the major mechanisms for controlling junipers on the property have been these grazing goats, as well as burning prescribed fires, which is pictured here in the bottom right image. They have established a long-term series of treatment plots across the property that fall into one of 4 management styles: burning, grazing, combination burning, grazing, and controls where no intervention is occurring. So going into known habitat preferences for this study species, Holbrookia lacerata, there is some studies preceding mine that have given us a rough idea of what the species prefers. That includes bare ground, sparse vegetation mosaics, compact soils, flat ground, proximity to roads, occasional shrubs or trees. But these studies have been conducted in field sites with typically more human disturbance or more agricultural, particularly like crop influence. The Sonora Station is a little different from these areas where since they've been working to cultivate these landscapes that more reflect pre-settlement Edwards Plateau regions. By studying their preferences here, we might get a better understanding of what the species preferred in historic habitats, which may also come to help us understand how they interact with the altered landscape today. This can also help inform land managers as they work on their land, what practices may benefit the species more. So getting into the actual study, we wanted to explore the habitat preferences of Holbrookia lacerata in the context of these common rangeland management practices, birding, grazing, and combinations thereof, viewed at 3 different scales. So we will have kind of a microhabitat scale, a plot level scale, which is about 100-meter diameter, and then a field site level scale. We largely performed this research through the marker capture study, which involved both active searches through walking surveys and opportunistic captures. We also conducted relocation surveys on adult lizards, which provided more habitat context for us to work with. And finally, we measured habitat at those 3 scales that I mentioned. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the first 2 of them mostly, the micro habitat and plot scale habitat. So we are in the process of updating our analyses on the field site, so I will touch on that more briefly towards the end. So starting off with our walking plot surveys, this was like the core of the study for the most part. We conducted these across the 3 years of the study, which concluded in 2024 last year. We had 40 plots across the station as seen on this map to the right here. Our plots were 100-meter in diameter, and the plots were divided amongst these 4 treatment types, which I'll get into in a second. Our surveys were conducted in a manner shown on the image on the left. 2 surveyors would start at the same point. I hope you can see my mouse. Would start at the same point at the edge of the circle, and they would walk in concentric decreasing half circles following these kind of squiggly lines towards the middle. The idea being, as you work your way towards the center of the circle, you would flush out any lizards or any other herps towards the center, and increase your likelihood of seeing them by the end of the survey. And so we did observe that working on not just the study species, but other lizard species as well. So it ended up working out very nicely. And then, like I said, these were divided amongst treatments. Plots were selected using a stratified random sampling design, which took into account soil makeup, likely to have the species, and then we had them divided amongst the treatments as well. So this is our breakdown of treatments: 8 burned, 16 graze, 10 burn and graze, and 6 control. We were slightly limited by land that was available, and so that's why the numbers aren't exactly even. Yeah. So once we actually did capture our lizards, we would, regardless of whether it was a survey lizard or opportunistic lizard, we would give it a toe clip ID, take location information and weather data, as well as morphometrics on the individual, such as snout vent length, tail weight, tail regeneration, and sex. The adults that were greater than 45 millimeters in snout vent length were also tagged for relocation surveys. So the relocation surveys, we conducted those using RFID tracking. And so this is a little different from what is more commonly used, the radiotelemetry, where with radiotelemetry you can search for a specific tag, or it's tagged individual. This is not quite as specific. So we use these yellow twist ties that you can see on the image to the top right. Not really a twist tie, but that's kind of what it looks like. We would use those tags on the lizard, put it right between their shoulder blades, and then we would use the device in the bottom right-hand corner, the Reco receiver, and it would pick up on the RFID tag that's on the lizard. It also, unfortunately, would sometimes pick up on vehicles or GPS units and phones, so we did have to be a little cautious when we were using it. But once you got within about 5 to 10 meters of the individual, you would start to pick up on it. We also put there's these colored paint dots on the tag, and we used that so that we didn't have to overly disturb our lizards when we came back to them. So we would track them for up to 6 days at a time, and come back to them until we either couldn't find them or found just a tag by itself, because they tended to drop them usually within that time frame. And as we relocated them, we could use our binoculars to identify them from a distance, or if the tag was dropped, that color code would correspond to their toe clip ID, so we knew who we were looking at. And then moving into the habitat data we collected, we had, like I said, we had this microhabitat and then plot scale habitat, so I'll go into each of those. At the smaller scale, we had these lizard tracking based microhabitat surveys, paired random sampling at lizard points. At the smallest scale, we looked at these habitat characteristics where the Holbrookia lacerata were found, and then a random paired nearby but unoccupied point. This means we would measure the following at the exact spot the lizard was found, which include using this 1 meter square frame, which you see in these 6 images on the left. We would measure soil compaction, aspect, slope and aspect, and we took a picture of the ground, which is why we have all these images. It would break the ground cover into different percentages, and so that could include bare ground, gravel, rock, forbs, grasses, detritus, and so on. And so we had the ground cover in percentages for that square. Then we also calculated tree and shrub canopy cover for each square. Then once that was measured at the point we found the lizard at, we would have measured them again at a nearby random point within about 5 to 25 meters of the first point. And so that was determined with a random compass direction and a random distance between that 5 to 25 meter range, which kept it nearby but a little ways away. So this would represent an area that was available to the lizard, but not necessarily used by them. Seeing a significant difference between these points could indicate a preference for certain microhabitats, which is why we're doing this. And so I'm representing this type of measurement with this symbol in the corner, these 2 squares connected by the line, just to help keep track of which habitat level we're talking about as I continue. So next, plot habitat surveys. This was like the mid-range scale of habitat we were looking at, and it was measured through a few characteristics, including tree density, microhabitat sampling across this whole circle, and shrub measurements. To conduct these measurements, we lined each plot with measuring tape from north to south and east to west, which is what you can see in this little diagram here. Those lines represent our measuring tapes on the ground. The tree density, which I'll start with, it was measured using the point-centered quarter method, and we had 4 tree categories: oaks and broadleaves, junipers, mesquites, and snags or dead trees. Once this plot was broken into 4 quarters, as you can see in the image, we would measure the distance, the shortest distance to one of these trees, to the nearest tree in each category, once per quarter of the plot. So that's 4 measurements, 1 per each category, per little piece of the pie, essentially. So that could give us information about each tree category, and then we could aggregate it into an overall tree measurement. Next, shrub cover. To approximate shrub cover for the plot, we would use these measuring tapes, the same ones represented by the lines in the plot here. Shrub length was measured along each cardinal direction as length that reached over that measuring tape. This is represented in the diagram here with these little orange clouds crossing the line. We summed up these measurements for a total shrub length value for the whole plot. So we'd measure both the directions and then have a total shrub length to kind of get an idea of the amount of shrub cover in each plot. And then lastly, we would do more of these microhabitat measurements. The only difference with these is we did not include the same tree and shrub cover measurements that we did outside of the plots, because those were already covered by the previous 2 measurements that I mentioned. So it's a lot more focused on the percent covers of different within the square. We had 20 of these measurements per plot. We had them at 10-meter increments, and so 10 in each direction, and then times 2 for the other direction. So for all these plot related measurements, I have them represented by the symbol in the corner, these crosshairs, essentially, that represent the circle in the 2 directions. Hopefully that'll help keep track of things as we move along. So I'll get into the results of these before I jump into the preliminary and third scale of habitat measurements towards the end. So for mark recapture results, as you can see, some years were busier than others. We started off with 13 individuals in year 1 and jumped up to 66 in year 2. This species, as well as the closely related Holbrookia subcaudalis south of the escarpment, they're known for their exhibiting boom-bust cycles. Our second year was our best in terms of captures, followed by year 3. You can see with the map to the right how this came across. On the landscape, we had some hot spots throughout the years. In the blue, you can see there were a lot found along near dirt roads. I hope you can see my mouse, but right here is one, and then there's a drivable path right here where we had a lot of individuals, and down here as well. So we had hot spots there, and then even in the third year, we ended up with hot spots in places that we had never before, or at least in the 2 previous years, seen individuals. So it was very interesting to see across the whole study. Moving into these other values, we only had 10 recaptures, which brings a total capture encounters up to 135. None of these recaptures were in between survey years, so it's only 125 distinct lizards. Interestingly, only 29 of our captures were actually during our walking surveys. Nearly 100 of them were opportunistic. Usually seen while walking, sometimes while driving. This often occurred when we're, for example, walking back to our trucks from doing surveys, or while conducting habitat surveys, or while relocating a known lizard. During the relocation surveys, occasionally one lizard could turn into 2 or more, particularly in these hot spots where we go to release one and find another in the process. So, how do these rangeland treatments factor into our captures? This bar chart breaks down where our lizards are being found. It includes the opportunistic lizards and our recaptures, so a total of 135. The grazing areas had the most captures, followed by our combination burn graze areas, but burned areas were really not that far behind. The starkest difference seems to be with the control areas, which only had 8 captures. We also ended up introducing an other category, since this includes the opportunistics that don't always fall into the treatment so nicely. This included lizards found on roads between 2 different treatments where we couldn't really be sure which side of the road it might have come from. Or a great example is one lizard that we found in the concrete parking lot of the station's office that really just does not fit into those treatments that we were focused on. So we have this breakdown, but we wanted to look more into how the different treatments compared to one another. So to better observe this interaction between lizard abundance treatments and other factors that might have been at play, we compared several different models to see what would best represent lizard presence in different treatment plots. Plots that never had a Holbrookia lacerata were considered absence plots, and then plots that had at least one Holbrookia lacerata encounter during the study were considered presence plots. So presence versus absence plots. These were our top scoring models, and I've highlighted in the red box the one that was best scoring by the AIC score. For those unfamiliar, the lower the score, the better, kind of like Uno. Our top model compared what we were calling all treatments to controls. That is, the burn, graze, and burn and graze were grouped together and compared only to controls. A least squares means post hoc test for the all treatments model showed a significant difference in Holbrookia lacerata presences between the control and the 3 other treatments. So put simply, the treatments themselves didn't make too much of a difference as long as some sort of disturbance was occurring, as long as it was not one of the controls. Moving into the more specific habitat results, this should give us an idea of maybe more fine scale, like what is affecting, what the lizards are preferring among things. So we'll start at that smaller scale of paired random microhabitat. These values come from a comparison of the lizard capture points and those nearby random points that we measured here. If we see a difference between the two, it can indicate a preferences for certain microhabitat variables. So we conducted a Permanova test that showed significant differences between the lizard and the random points. The variables within this test are shown in the table here, which includes the paired t-test scores. So going through these variables, detritus for us in this study referred only to plant matter and was mostly leaf litter, but included like twigs or branches. Organic cover was almost exclusively at this field site was almost exclusively goat droppings, and so it has a relation to the presence of grazing here. Since it was predominantly goats, they did have some sheep, but it was mostly goats here. So I've bolded the 2 variables that showed significant differences between used and available points. The lizards were being found in areas with more gravel cover and less tree cover. This indicates some preference for maybe more open areas, but as we move into, I have more of a visualization of these variables. This is an NMDS plot. If anyone's unfamiliar with those, it basically, these arrows indicate trends for each variable, and the points belong to either lizard used points or the random available unused points. So in this figure, you're kind of seeing a slight trend of lizard points towards areas with increased ground compaction and gravel cover. Additionally, random points showed a trend towards more tree and detritus cover. So expanding a little bit to the plot habitat variables, I have them grouped twice into 2 different groups. This is a kind of an overview of the plot, and then I'm going to zoom in on tree values. But starting off, this again compares presence and absence plots. So again, any plot that had at some point a Holbrookia lacerata versus those that we never found a Holbrookia lacerata in. Our Permanova indicated a significant difference between presence and absence plots. The table here shows the t-test results for the variables involved. Tree density includes all of our tree values. For the plot, ground vegetation values were taken from the microhabitat squares and they included forbs and grasses combined. And then bare ground includes gravel, rock, or bare ground and dirt. The 2 variables that showed significance here, they're again bolded. They indicate this indicates that plots where Holbrookia lacerata were found tended to have lower tree density and higher bare ground. And then I have another visual here again, another NMDS plot. This is just shows the arrows and ellipses. They kind of indicate that we saw more shorter vegetation or ground vegetation, as it says here, or as it said previously. In bare ground in the plots where Holbrookia lacerata were found, and there were more trees in the absence plots. So like I said, I kind of zoomed in on these like trees specifically. Still looking within the plots, I've broken them down by the 4 categories: juniper, oak, mesquite, dead trees, and then I kept shrubs in there. The Permanova, it did not show significant difference between presence and absence plots overall. However, the t-test showed that presence plots had significantly fewer oaks in them. So there seems to be significance with the oaks specifically, but overall, this did not show significance. And then again, another visualization here. You can see the arrows indicating that absence plots tended to have more of the oaks. So I'm going to discuss these a little bit more before I get into that last larger scale view of everything. And this will hopefully provide more context for that as well. So my results are showing that Holbrookia lacerata seem to prefer more bare ground, more gravel, less tree cover, particularly oaks. This image is a pretty good example of such habitat. There's bare ground, there's gravel present, there's some vegetation, there's not a whole lot of trees here, and the vegetation's pretty thin. You can also see in, some similar, some of the results from previous studies in here as well. For example, Hibbets et al. 2021, they saw some significant proximity to roads with the lizard. And so actually in the background here, you can see a dirt road going by. So that this species was seen near roads as well. But their study left trees a little more open-ended. My tree results can hopefully clarify what was kind of left to question in that study. So this study, I was able to show that Holbrookia lacerata prefer areas with less oaks, and there seemed to be a slight trend of selecting against junipers as well. It was very slight in that T-table. It was not significant though. At our field site, heavy detritus areas were actually very associated with oaks and junipers. So this right-hand image where there's a lot of leaf litter and the branches and all that, it was taken under an oak tree. And so these areas have very low gravel and low bare ground availability. Although some trees did have a lot more open structures, like this mesquite on the left. And we actually did find a lizard under this tree. And so what we may be seeing is that the lizards are avoiding dense stands of oak trees and potentially junipers, and less so open structure and less dense stands of trees, which at the field site usually meant mesquites and snags, which are no longer dropping any leaves and the like. These findings align and expand upon previous research, particularly Hibbets et al. 2021, which had a very similar study, but in a different area. These studies mentioned the lizard being found on open ground, low detritus areas with higher gravel and forb cover, and I was able to show that there was some trend of avoiding tree cover, particularly these oaks, which leave a lot of detritus on the ground. So I'm going to touch now on the larger scale view of things. This field site scale habitat, we performed a supervised classification on the field site and then used that to create an ensemble species distribution model. These analyses were done through ArcGIS Pro and RStudio using satellite imagery and remote sensing. The supervised classification breaks the area down into habitat classes, and then I took those classes as variables and included them as an ensemble species distribution model. The model shows me areas that the lizard is more likely to be found based on lizard capture and lizard capture data and the habitat variables that I shared with it. So getting into this supervised classification a little bit more, for those unfamiliar, I'll keep it brief. I feed the program essentially my layers of my area, my region of interest, that is, that include landscape information. So that could be vegetation indices, elevation, or canopy height models. Then I create training examples or little polygons that I use to tell the program what a tree looks like, what the grassy areas look like, and so on, based off of my knowledge of the area. And then the model takes these two things and classifies the entire area based on the information I give it. So getting into my actual layers that I used, all of these layers were either acquired in or resampled to a 1 meter resolution. I chose this fine scale resolution because this is a very small lizard, and a lot of our focus was on fine scale habitat differences, and so we wanted to keep those at a very small resolution. So first off, I had National Agriculture Imagery Program imagery. I had it from 2 time periods. June 2022 was a time period within my study period, and then September 2024 is just outside of it. But the reason I had both of them is because June 2022 was a very dry period. It was kind of a drought for the area. And so this kind of made it a little difficult to understand all of the vegetation in the area. So September 2024 is imagery from a much wetter period. And so I'm able to distinguish a lot more grasses from bare ground and senesced vegetation. So vegetation that might be dormant when it was a lot drier and a lot greener when when rainfall would happen. And then I included percent clay content and percent sand content for the top 15 centimeters of the area. And then I included a canopy height model, which just tells me how tall vegetation is throughout the area. And then a normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI. This takes the imagery band information from the NAIP imagery and helps highlight vegetation. And so that's this image on the right here. These red areas, the very bright red areas, are areas of very high vegetation, and the grayed out areas are areas with little to no living vegetation. And so this vegetation index helps distinguish between like dead trees and living trees, for example, or can even be used to distinguish different tree types. And I have this value for both June 2022 and September 2024 to help distinguish vegetations. And then I included a texture layer, which helps distinguish different objects from each other. I was able to run it on both the 2022 imagery and the 2024 imagery. Moving into the parameters of the classification I ran, I used pixel-based classification, and I used the support vector machine algorithm, or SVM. I told the program to give me 4 different classes. I wanted to distinguish trees from grasses and senesced vegetation, or basically dormant vegetation, and bare ground. And bare ground includes areas like cliche roads. This imagery here is just taken from the canopy height model that you can see. I also performed an accuracy assessment. I had nearly 500 ground truth points, and they were selected with the stratified random sampling design. This is all being performed in ArcGIS. So this is the output of my supervised classification. I'll have a couple slides here where I kind of zoom in on some of these hot spots. The Holbrookia lacerata presences are marked with the yellow dots here. And these zoom-ins kind of show the bare ground is the red areas, the grass is the blue areas, and the senesced vegetation is orange areas. So you can see, for example, here, those are the areas where we're mostly seeing these individuals. Go to the next slide. Another example. So we had a lot of individuals near this roadway. That's this red line that's cutting through here. And then back here is actually a caliche pit. So we didn't see anything down in the pit, but we had a lot here next to like a very small like ATV road that kind of turned off here and along this road here. And then one more zoom in here. We had this area is a lot of senesced vegetation, a lot of bare ground, very few trees mixed in, but we had a lot of presences in the senesced vegetation along here as well. So, like I said, I ran an accuracy assessment, and this is the resulting confusion matrix and accuracy scores. The overall accuracy was about 79% for the supervised classification, and my kappa score was a 0.70, which represents a substantial agreement between the variables. Another thing to look at here is producer and user accuracy. So producer accuracy is how accurately these classification results are in my eyes as the one who produced the map. And then this is an error. This shows errors of omission or false negatives. And the user accuracy is how accurately a reader, for example, you guys, can use the map. So how often does that class on the map indicate what is actually on the ground? So you can see here we did have a couple of, I guess, troublesome classes, particularly the grasses in the user accuracy were a little low in some of these scores, but otherwise things scored at least pretty well for what we're using it for. Speaking of which, the point of the classification was to create basically mapped variables of land classes that I could use in an ensemble species distribution model. This is where I've run this, and this is where it starts to get preliminary. So I have an early version of it. I still need to rerun it with my most updated supervised classification, and we're making some updates to the ESDM otherwise as well. Just as a review, though, for those unfamiliar with ESDMs, they take environmental variables from an area and sometimes presence absence data if possible of a species, and they can be used to identify suitable habitat for that species based on the habitat variables provided. This sort of thing can and has been used to predict animal distributions with the effect of climate change. However, we're focused solely on the current habitat preferences shown by Holbrookia lacerata at this field site. The map variables included in the preliminary ESDM are currently the canopy height model, the NDVI, and the land cover classification results from the supervised classification. The supervised classification, like I said, had been conducted at a 1 meter resolution. We scaled things up here to a 10-meter resolution, and through that we were able to make all of our variables continuous. And then for this model, we only had presence data as well. So what made this an ensemble species distribution model is the use of multiple models or algorithms to best evaluate habitat suitability. Of the models that were tested, random forest was the strongest scoring model. We still included the multiple models, even though this one scored higher. We would still include multiple models, at least that did not score awfully in this test, and aggregate the results to keep one model from overly biasing the results too much. In the end, we had 8 algorithms that we used. And presence-only data can have some bias, so we set this to have 10 runs to account for the lack of absence data. So getting into some of the results of that, these are our top scoring variables. These had the most importance in predicting the presence of Holbrookia lacerata. The top variable overall was canopy height, followed by bare ground and synecipitation, and then the normalized vegetation index, the NDVI. So for canopy height model, the lizard was most likely to be present. It's a little hard to see on this one, but I'll zoom in here in a second. More likely to be present when canopy height was less than 1 meter, indicating a preference for fewer trees. And then bare ground, we had similar findings in the marker capture microhabitat study, where we're finding that they preferred areas with more bare ground. Positive values with the NDVI jumping past senescent vegetation. With the NDVI, positive values of the NDVI near 0 usually indicate bare ground. So those values are most likely associated with bare ground or the caliche roads. And then, yes, zooming in on this canopy height model, you can kind of see the trend a little bit better here. So down here is the actual canopy height and the probability of presence. Probability of presence increased a lot more once we kind of get under that 1 meter of canopy height. And then moving to the output map of this, the Holbrookia lacerata presence probability is shown here in lighter colors and darker colors where it's less likely to be seen. And then I included in the blue diamonds our actual Holbrookia lacerata presences. And so you can see that obviously a lot of them are showing up in areas that were highly likely to have Holbrookia lacerata, but interestingly, we do have areas that have been highlighted that don't show that we did not encounter the species in. And we didn't survey every single square inch of the area, but there are some areas that interestingly popped up, even though we maybe had to drive through them a few times, or we did have plots in there and we weren't finding them, which is kind of interesting. So getting into conclusions now. So Holbrookia lacerata, they seem to have a preference for mixed or heterogeneous microhabitats. They avoided trees, but trees were still nearby. It wasn't a black and white sort of difference. Habitat did not need to be completely devoid of trees. Some were okay. Dense stands of trees, not so much. Let's see. Speaking of the field site, this field site is very unique in comparison to the other studies. These treatments were very controlled compared to other areas. We don't have croplands in these areas, cattle, or high anthropogenic disturbances, which many of these previous studies did have. And so that makes this study a lot more unique. These also reflect, or are trying to reflect at least, historic grasslands or ecosystems of the Edwards Plateau. The previous studies have also been much larger scale, usually regional, whereas mine is a pretty small scale in the end. This focus exists in this paper and in other papers because Holbrookia lacerata, as well as Holbrookia subcaudalus, are being found in croplands today, as well as areas with cattle or high anthropogenic disturbances, for example, oil and gas pads. So that's why the other studies do include those areas. But I wanted to look at kind of the rangeland focused area as well as one that might reflect more historic landscapes. There seems to be some importance for early successional areas for this species. There's the natural areas versus the man-made areas. We have all these areas near roadways that might have some disturbance, but also when it came to the treatments, as long as some kind of disturbance, whether it was these prescribed fires or the goats was happening, we tended to see a lot more of the lizards. Moving into bringing it back to Holbrookia subcaudalus, as I mentioned, they're still under review, federal review for listing. By comparison to Holbrookia lacerata, they are harder to find and they do have a patchier range. So while they are not the same species, they are very similar in their preferences, as Hibbets et al. 2021 has shown. They do prefer grassland mosaics, bare ground, and sparse herbaceous vegetation and the use of dirt roads. So it's similar enough that my results could have implications for the preferences of Holbrookia subcaudalus, which, like I said, is still under review. Moving out of Holbrookia, though, the Texas horned lizard also has kind of similar preferences. They prefer areas with bare ground patches. This is used for basking or for their harvester ant mounds. And then they also prefer areas with low ground level detritus. Typically, management plans with a focus on the Texas horned lizard usually recommend prescribed fire. So that happens to fall within the treatments that worked for Holbrookia lacerata in this study. And then moving beyond lizards, the bobwhite quail, they also kind of have similar preferences. They tend to prefer denser woody patches interspersed on grasslands. They like some bare ground and open ground level space so they can move more freely. Management that's focused on bobwhite typically recommends like patchwork prescribed fires. So that would also benefit Holbrookia lacerata. As I get towards the end here, the headline takeaway is management for the Edwards Plateau fauna and habitat maintenance that focuses on burning or grazing schemes is also going to benefit Holbrookia lacerata. Like we've said, there's no preference for a particular treatment, burn and graze, other than avoiding these control areas, it seems. As long as management practices seem to be reducing tree density, particularly in oaks and possibly junipers as well, things that minimize detritus accumulation and things that maintain patchy microhabitats, you're probably going to be benefiting this lizard as well. With that, any questions? I'll pass it off to Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. That was great. A lot of material there. There are some questions. There's quite a few actually in the chat here, so we'll go ahead and get stuck in. Has the double half circle circular pathway method that you described to use for your walking surveys been found to improve detection in comparison to straight transect and defense methods?
So if I recall, a lot of that one paper that I refer to quite a lot, the Hibbets et al., I believe they use straight transect. But we did find that we were able to, like, we were flushing our lizard out. And it was very visible, not just with the Holbrookia lacerata, but with, in particular, Aspidoscelis gularis, or the Texas spotted whiptail. Might be common whiptail. Anyway, we would flush it out, and we'd see it either multiple times as we're working our way towards the center, or we'd see it heading over to the other person. So we did find that this was pretty successful in increasing the likelihood of seeing our lizards rather than walking in a straight line. When we walk in a straight line, often they'll just take off, and we don't have a chance of coming across them again if they're taking cover. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, next question. Is there a potential for differences in detection of lizards between the control and treatments?
Yes, so we tried to look at that a little bit. I think the controls were more difficult to walk through, generally speaking, more difficult to walk through, and had a lot more ground cover. But one of the reasons we think they're simply not there and just not being there, not being detected, is because a lot of the ones we did see were near roadways that happen to cut through the control areas. And so they would be hanging out on the road and basking there, and then going to the side where there's maybe some rocks and some vegetation. But when we were deep within like the trees, we really weren't seeing as much of them. And so part of it could be visibility, and that is another reason we included the 2 time periods, because when this station experienced a lot of rain, we would get booms and blooms of a lot of ground vegetation, particularly like grasses and forbs and stuff, and that could make it harder to see them. Despite that, we were still seeing a lot more of them in the treated areas rather than the controls. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, this detection probability issues are always around, aren't they? So it's hard to deal with it completely. Did you determine whether any changes in the presence of their preferred food played a role in your counts?
So we did not take any measurements on their prey items. Mostly includes insects. We did not take any insect measurements. So I can't really comment too much on that. All I can say is, I guess as vegetation would increase, we might get booms of certain insects that might help more. But between the years, we weren't seeing like a lot more insects one year and a lot more lizards. But we also were not, that is not something we are actively measuring. So I can only say so much on that.
And continuing on that topic here, there's 2 other questions. Basically, what is the lizard's preferred diet? Do we know?
To my knowledge, insects, pretty much insectivores. I don't believe they eat any, they're not carnivorous, really eating other lizards or anything. They're pretty small, so it's mostly insects, yeah.
Probably generalist.
Yeah,
insect, not like, like
yeah,
horned lizards eat ants and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
yeah. Nothing specific.
Very good. Somebody asked, what is the current extant populations? Where the current extant populations found? Did you have a map of the range of the
Um,
of
I don't think I
lacerata?
included a specific range map. So within the Edwards Plateau, that should pretty much encapsulate Holbrookia lacerata. Um, I think some range maps might have come across as a little patchy because, like I mentioned, these guys are very boom bust, and so one year you'll be like overflowing with these lizards in one area, and then you come back next year and the year after that and you're not seeing them. And you can have the vice versa happen where it's always been dead in this one spot and then suddenly you're seeing a ton of them. But um, in a general sense, pretty much the Edwards Plateau is what consists of their range.
Great, thank you. Okay, can you speak to any differences among the sexes of the lizards in association with detection patterns and habitat use?
I think in the end, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head the exact numbers, but I do believe we had more males than females. We still had it is still, I think, kind of close to 50-50. So we were surveying them during their reproductive period, and so we would get males and breeding females, and then we would towards the end get the hatchlings. Um, we didn't do a lot of comparisons between the sexes. I think we might have checked and we weren't getting a lot of significance, so we just kind of did not pursue that. So
Very good. There's a question here. It says, are there land management implications to your study, or did you find that drought, dead vegetation, largely dictates where lizards are found and occur?
I think it's hard to say with just 3 years of study, and I think only one of them was like one of the first year was supposed to be, I believe, like a much harsher drought than the other 2 years, which were only technically droughts, but a lot wetter by comparison from what I was seeing with the climate data. So it's a little hard to say when we really only have the 3 years for sure that the rain might have had something to do with it. Um, in the papers that I've read, we're not entirely sure what is causing their boom bust cycles. I mean, it's probably associated with food and whatnot, and what makes their prey, more populous and thus them, but that hasn't been studied explicitly. So it's kind of hard to tell exactly what is causing like boom bust cycles and more presences between years. Did I get to the question? Sorry.
Yeah, I think the question is maybe more about does drought supersede
Okay.
land management in terms of its importance in predicting where they are? But my view is it probably not in terms of the.
Yeah, it's hard to say because our driest year was the quietest year, but it's hard to say if that was the reason. I would say as long as you still have those aspects, the some trees but not a dense amount, which is not affected by like a year by year drought, that's going to be more of a long-term thing. um Bare ground versus like how much dense vegetation or detritus is on the ground could be affected by the drought. um but as long as you have, patches of bare ground interspersed with, I'd say, some some light small vegetation, trees, like I said, a little bit of trees are probably okay. um as long as you have that, it might not matter quite as much how much of a drought it is. um yeah.
Yeah, cool. That's a good question. Somebody asked if you could show the title of your talk again, please.
Yes, yes. Let me just scroll back 50
Yeah.
slides.
While you're doing that, somebody asks here how you were securing the tags to the lizards.
Yes, super glue. We found some brands worked better than others. I'd be happy to talk really in depth about that if you're actually interested. But yeah, so it was just super glue, and it was safe for the lizard because they usually performed ecdysis or shed their skin within a few days of the tag going on, and sometimes they weren't, like the most rock solid way to affix the tag to him. So usually, like I said, they fell off within that 6-day mark. I think we only had one known occurrence of this tag staying on for a couple of weeks. And so we had an individual, I believe it was a female, who was marked in one session. And then we came back a couple weeks later in the next session and actually accidentally, not accidentally, but we were searching with the RFID for a different individual and found her still with her tag on from last time. So that's really the only instance we were sure of that they held on to a tag for more than those 6 days. Otherwise, they usually dropped in relatively quickly.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so the last question is, it seems like the Edwards Plateau varies in terms of precipitation from east to west and south to north. Does that matter for the species? Would they be more common in the drier parts?
More common in the drier parts. I think it's going to come down to what the vegetation looks like on a smaller scale. Kind of what we're seeing is that like they can be pretty hardy in terms of what is available to them. Like we said, they're kind of being seen around croplands and disturbed areas. So when it comes to drought or amount of precipitation, I guess it would only come down to, does it have the right vegetation variables? Does it have, not too many trees, a few some forbs, but a good amount of bare ground for them to hunt on? So I don't know if I can completely answer that question without looking into it a little bit myself, but really based off of what I've done, I'd say as long as you have those on a smaller scale, the vegetation and bare ground requirements, probably a good chance of seeing them. But their boom bust cycle does make them still slightly unpredictable across the whole region, as what has been seen in previous studies.
That's great.
I can try to keep going, but
No, that's good. I think the
okay.
point of the question is it's probably harder to maintain barer ground in the kind of eastern part of
Yeah.
the hill country because of increased precipitation and all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's just tougher to keep those conditions there. So especially in the, in the absence of management. No, that's great. Well, that is all the questions. Katie, thanks again so much for coming and talking to us today. I'm going to close things